Hello and welcome to the very first installment of a special series, The Spirit of Santos de Cartier, here on Monocle Radio. The show is a journey that begins all the way back in 1904 when Louis Cartier granted the wish of the famous Brazilian aviator Alberto Santos Dumont to be able to read the time while flying. The birth of the first watch specifically designed to be worn on the wrist sealed the bonds of friendship between these two pioneers and started an incredible story. It's a pleasure to welcome you as we explore that tale on today's episode. I'm Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director. In forthcoming episodes, we will look to the future of the Santos and explore how this unique timepiece will continue to shape not just the future of watchmaking, but the very fabric of popular culture. But today, we start by establishing the role of the Santos wristwatch in the wider Cartier story, by reflecting on the Maison's extraordinary design legacy.
We wanted to tell the story of the human elements behind the Cartier story, especially at the beginning of the 1900s, the turn of the 20th century. And that storytelling really is about the people.
This is a celebration of the enduring spirit of the Santos de Cartier. And now it's time to meet our guest. Welcome to the Spirit of Santos de Cartier. Joining me today, I am delighted to say we have Helen Molesworth, the Victoria and Albert's senior curator of jewellery, who was behind the museum's blockbuster Cartier exhibition, charting the house's history and incredible ability to balance past and present, heritage and modernity. I started by asking Helen to tell me about the experience of curating the exhibition, which was one of the best-selling in the V&A's history.
It's been a wonderful experience. I think working with Cartier has been an absolute dream in the sense that you're dealing with one of, the greatest names in jewellery and watchmaking history. And it's also a wonderful group of teams that we worked with directly because you see the heritage ethos of this belief in craftsmanship and creativity still running through the company today. So that was really lovely because I could see all the work we were doing historically was still present in the culture of the company. So that's a really nice thing to be able to say. I think now is a really good time for this sort of exhibition. There hadn't been a Cartier exhibition in London for 30 years. So this was the first major retrospective in London since the one at the British Museum 30 years ago. This one was actually the biggest Cartier exhibition ever put on in the UK. And one of the things I've realised, people are enjoying it so much. I think it's a great escape from the real world around us when there's a lot going on. And it's brought great joy to the visitors. You see beautiful objects with this great passion behind their creation. And it can only really, this beauty and this sort of human brilliance can only inspire happiness in the visitor. And I think that's what it's done.
That's so interesting. I wanted to ask you, actually, you host so many different exhibitions, different brands. How did you feel made this so special and what was the public perception? Because from what I would hear, there was so much warmth and excitement around it, but it'd be interesting to hear your perspective as well.
I think that's exactly right. And it's been quite amazing to hear such a positive response. I think we've just had positive feedback. And that's such a lovely thing to have when you spend, several years putting together an exhibition at this level of depth of information and this amount of work that goes into it. And I think this positive reaction is partly because of really exceptional objects. You've got to give credit to some of the most beautiful jewels and clocks and watches and objets in the world are on view here. We're very lucky. There are jewels here that are some of the most important in the world, some of the most famous, some never before seen. This sort of combination of really magical creativity, I think that's counted for a lot of it. And like I said, people's reactions to it being so positive, it's just an absolute pleasure as a curator to be able to inspire that level of joy in the visitor.
That's so interesting. It sounds like it's almost instinctive, like as humans we're drawn to beauty and this beautiful design objects.
And I think we're also drawn to respect human creativity. So I think it's got this lovely combination where we have absolutely stunning objects and then also other great objects with lovely stories. So there's a lot of this is about storytelling and telling a narrative. But I think, as part of that narrative, we wanted to tell the story of the human elements behind the Cartier story, especially at the beginning of the 1900s, the turn of the 20th century. And that storytelling really is about the people. So we all know Cartier was founded in 1847 by Louis-François Cartier. But really our story at the V&A starts with the three grandsons of the founder, and that's Louis, Pierre, and Jacques. And the story we start telling is how those brothers built an international business and how they had this strategy to do so. And I think that's been part of the success of the exhibition, has been building in those human stories and those really sort of personal elements in how the objects tell the story of the family. And I think people really associate when they can associate that with another person, and they realize these great businesses start as a family business and there are brothers and parents just like we all have experienced.
And I'm curious for you, as someone who I'm sure had deep knowledge of the house and its history from before, but did anything new come across, or did something strike you when you delved deeper into the stories as part of curating the exhibition?
I think I learnt a level of respect for the ingenuity of the three brothers that I didn't quite have in its total understanding as before. I looked at quite in detail how Louis, as the creative director early in the 20th century, really drove this new style in the early 20th century of jewellery design in particular. This idea of looking around the world around him as to inspiration for ideas, and Pierre and Jacques too. And I think one of the things that I really learned was this homogeneity between the brothers to be able to work together. And of course, they had set up in 3 different cities. So Louis stayed in Paris, Pierre was a businessman and went to New York, and Jacques loved gems and worked with the Maharajas as gem lovers and the royal families in Europe and came to London. And I think the first thing I learned was this brilliant homogeneity of how a family business had the strength of those relationships. But the details, I think there was one thing in particular very early on. I found it was almost an invoice in the archives that had been published, it was known, where Louis had been collecting Egyptian antiquities, for example. And he had a great collection of Persian miniatures and carpets and catalogues, Middle Eastern works and jades from China. He loved sort of collecting. But he'd bought in 1914 a collection of Egyptian faience. 3 of the pieces on the list from the dealer, I realised were in our exhibition, that had been made into jewellery in 1925 and 1926, after the craze of Tutankhamun's tomb being discovered in 22. And I think what this showed me, and it's hopefully something we've really expressed in the exhibition, was that ability to be able to be ahead of the times at the time and to come up with something that just tapped into what people were interested in. To have the antiquities 10 years earlier, have this amazing craze kick off and then go, use these now, this is what people want. He was ahead of the time by buying them in the first place, on the pulse of society to use them in the jewels. And I think that's what I wanted people to see in the exhibition, and that was my greatest learning, how brilliantly on point these 3 brothers were, and something that continues through the company through the 20th century.
Exactly. It's so interesting because you're talking about a very modern story of business and entrepreneurship, looking ahead in terms of design as well, but at the same time, really also at looking to the past and having this fascination with history and antiquities. And I wonder, do you find that the success of a house like Cartier up until today is this ability to achieve this very fine balance between evolution and modernity and embracing the times, but also really acknowledging and respecting history and its own heritage, especially today?
Natalie, I think you have hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I think the lesson is from this exhibition, that Cartier have had this respect for heritage and history and an interest in the world around them and the cultures of previous generations and countries, and also their own culture and their own heritage. and an ability to reinvent that into something that is absolutely new and of the time, that is something that people want. And it's been this constant nod to heritage with this future looking forwards with innovation that I think has been the success of Cartier. You've said it exactly. Thank you for that.
No, I think following the house and also seeing how crowded the market is today, it seems like there's some sort of magic formula with that balance, and it's also in everything that you've been saying. But I'd love to speak about the Santos in particular because it does encapsulate a lot of these themes, and it's a great example of the Cartier brothers' ability to innovate. You've chosen to display the first Santos that was created by Louis Cartier. Tell me about the decision to showcase that piece in particular, and what does it say about the House of Cartier?
This early Santos is such a great part of the Cartier story. I think we all know the story where partly Louis Cartier, again, being just at the right place in history and knowing what is needed. Because, of course, it was the great famous aviator, Alberto Santos Dumont, who was winning these amazing prizes for his flying contraptions and airships and aviation in general. But he was struggling because, of course, wasn't able to check the time while he was piloting. And in 1904, Louis came up with the idea of creating for his friend, Santos Dumont, a wristwatch. And this is sort of one of the earliest wristwatches that we know of for men with a completely functional form. You know, the idea was that he could carry on flying while he could see the time. What happened next is it wasn't until sort of 1911 that this became a commercial concept for Louis, because it was made for a friend originally. And we have a really lovely Santos wristwatch from 1915 in the exhibition. So it's one of the early ones. And I think you look at this watch, not only is the story wonderful, you know, this is a great example of how Louis was right in the middle of massive social changes. And he was at that point in society part of the massive changes that we see happening at the beginning of the 20th century. But he came up with an idea that has changed watchmaking history for us following onwards from that, and something that has become such an important part of our day-to-day lives. So the watch we've got is really lovely because it's an early one. And you look at it and you just think, this is such a beautiful object. It's also not just functional, but its form is fabulous. It's just got everything you want in a beautiful object. It's got clean lines. It's got this balance between the case and the strap. These wonderful Roman numerals. We're on the tan leather strap with the gold face and the sapphire winder. And you just see this pure balance of aesthetic beauty together with function. That, for me, again, is another classic sign of brilliant Cartier design.
And do you think that the Santos has gone on to really influence the timepieces that followed? Do you see a red thread?
Yes, I think we all do. I think you can see that it was such a successful first design that they didn't need to have a lot done to it for it to continue to be something that everybody would want. You know, it wasn't just made for one aviator. It's almost as if it's been made for a whole generation. And I see that in the Santos, and then you look at the tanks that came after, and you realise that there is that really sort of early success that spoke volumes and set up, like I said, a generation of watch enthusiasts and all the ones that followed.
Absolutely. And I think it came to define Cartier's overall design style, right? And this embracing of modernity.
Exactly. And I think modernity is such a great word in this conversation, because it really is that sort of idea of being right on the edge of something new, but also driving what's coming ahead. And it's all very well to create a watch when people need watches, but to create the first wristwatch that a man is going to wear in that situation, and for it to be almost like a prototype. You know, I think the first one was given to Santos Dumont in 1904, but it wasn't until sort of 1911 that we see them being made for the commercial market by Cartier. So again, it's so ahead of their times to be able to come up with this concept. Modernity is a great way of describing that.
And it's interesting how you're speaking about Louis Cartier and him being kind of in the midst of social change and so ahead of his time. And I wonder, what do you think it was about him that made him so forward-thinking? Were there certain qualities about him? What is it when you would think about Louis Cartier, the person?
I think he had two things about him. The first is he had a brilliant eye for design. And I look at these early designs. He was obviously not the designer himself, but the head of creative direction. There are phrases where we know he turned to his workmen and said, study this particular thing, look at that, and help them sort of come up with refining the inspiration that they presented. He obviously just had that eye for perfect balance. And I think that's quite a rare thing in an artist. And I see that side coming out in the archives, but in the jewels themselves and the watches. You see he has an eye for design. And I think the second thing, which is what I think really appeals to me personally, is this interest in the world around him. He just had this constant ability to look outwards, be fascinated with what was around him, always on the lookout for something next and interesting. He was as much a collector and a connoisseur as he was the head of a business and a design director. And I look at the different archives we've seen and what we knew was in his collection. I mentioned it briefly already. He had this extraordinary library that included the best collection of Islamic art catalogues, probably in Paris. He lent those to his designers to come up with this new series of Islamic-inspired jewels in the 1900s. Things that I don't think we even understood in the last 20 years was part of that inspiration. For a long time, those things were sort of described as garland-style jewels, but they were really early Art Deco because they were becoming geometric because of his Islamic art and Islamic architecture. And this idea that he was just interested in everything around him, he had this ability to somehow distill that into that clean eye of design. I think he inspired his designers. I look at all the different things they did from the 1900s to the 1930s when Louis was in place. You have things that are red and green from China with wonderful Chinese inspiration. You have the blues and the greens that were inspired by the Middle East and this peacock colours, things that came from Russian inspiration and then France and Egypt, obviously. He had this ability to look out but refine it into something that was just so of the period. And I think produce things for people that they couldn't have imagined they wanted, but when they saw them, you fell in love with them. So I think my answer is two things. One is a brilliant eye and an interest in the world around him. Those are my guesses of his character personalities that I think are so fantastic and so successful.
How incredible. And I think it's so amazing that that's a story that anyone could relate to. And whether you're an entrepreneur or designer, there's something to take away today, even though it happened a century ago.
Yes, I love that. I think that's also how you connect in a successful exhibition for the viewer and the visitor, is to make it something that we can all relate to. I'm a historian as well as a gemologist and a jewellery person, but one of the things you learn is that in history, people never really change. We all have a way to connect to our pasts and to different people around all over the world and at every different time. That's what's so fascinating.
I think that's such a beautiful note to end on. You've really captured, I think, the spirit of Louis Cartier and made me even more curious to come back and see the exhibition.
Well, I hope you get a chance to see it. We've had it on since April through to the middle of November, and it's been one of the most successful exhibitions. There's a great book that's been written too for the exhibition that's been on the Sunday Times bestseller list, which is exciting. All I can say is I hope that this has brought every visitor happiness in some way and that they've been able to enjoy it as much as I have.
That was Helen Molesworth, Victoria and Albert's Senior Curator of Jewellery. The exhibition continues at the V&A in London until the 16th of November. Hurry and catch the final days. Next time, we discuss both the genesis and the future of the Santos and how this unique timepiece has shaped and continues to shape the art of watchmaking.
People want watches that tell stories, and the Santos tells an incredible story, right? Like the original story of wristwatches. And then you also have this idea that Cartier is a lasting brand. And when you look at so many of the popular watches today, we don't know if a lot of these brands will be around in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We know that Cartier will. And more than they'll be around, they'll be thriving. They'll be doing what they do and what they've done for over 100 years already.
This is the spirit of the Santos de Cartier, a Monocle Radio production brought to you in partnership with Cartier. The program was produced and edited by Lily Austin. I'm Natalie Theodosi. Thanks for listening.